Welcome back to Trauma, Healing, and Nutrition, a podcast series sponsored by Repair. To learn more about Repair, visit us online at repairconnect.org. This episode is part 1 of 2 and is titled Certified Organic, Separating Fact from Fiction. I'm Beth Rebay, the podcast host. I'd like to begin by speaking a little bit about the relationship between trauma and food quality. If you listen to our pilot episode, one of the things that you may recall is that a consequence of exposure to repeated and significant levels of trauma or traumatic stress is that it does damage to the cells in our body, and that damage can contribute to a range of physical ailments, impairments, and illnesses, some of which can be quite significant or life-threatening or can degenerate quality of life. And as you may also recall, one of the most significant things that we can do to help our bodies heal from the damage caused by exposure to both physical and emotional traumas is to give ourselves good quality nutrition. So in other words, the ways in which our body is able or not able to recuperate as fully as possible from exposure to trauma is in part dependent on our access to nutrition. There's a contemporary field known as molecular psychiatry, which, among other things, essentially examines the ways in which psychological or psychiatric conditions manifest at a cellular level. And within that field, there's an ongoing area of study about the physiological impact of living with chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. An example involves a recently defined concept, namely accelerated aging hypothesis, which is essentially a way to describe the ways in which prolonged exposure to traumatic stress can cause enough cellular damage in our bodies that it essentially functions to escalate the cellular process of aging. In other words, to speed up and accelerate the ways in which our body breaks down and the cells in our body deteriorate faster, are less able to do what they need to do, and are not replaced as rapidly. So, as noted, this is an emerging area of study. There's still a lot more to know, but I bring it up as an example of the ways in which trauma can be incredibly significant in predicting future health. And as we also noted in the pilot episode, one of the most significant ways in which we can mitigate and manage trauma is through access to good quality food. And this is true for a couple of reasons. One is that when we're eating unhealthy or more toxic food, it will contain more substances and more unstable molecules, which essentially also cause cellular damage. So, for instance, if you combine the pollutants within our food with the physiological effects of traumatic stress, the two combine to essentially do more damage to our cells. But there's another reason, which is that healthy and clean food can be incredibly healing. It can repair cellular damage. It can help our bodies release and manage traumatic stress so that less damage is done in the first place, and it can help repair physiological functions that are being impaired by the stress associated with prolonged exposure to trauma. So in a nutshell, if trauma is one incredible source of damage in our bodies, food is one of the things that we most need in order to survive that damage and maximize our chances of healing and of restoring some of our life expectancy, getting to live as long and as well as we're able to. From here, I want to move on to the primary focus of this two-part feature, which is about certified organic standards in the United States and what it means to describe food as organic or certified organic. And one of the things that I find is generally true is that when I ask people, what does certified organic mean? I'll hear a few different things. Sometimes people will say it means it has no chemicals. Sometimes people will say it means they didn't use any pesticides making the food. Sometimes people will say, well, it means it's cleaner. Sometimes people will say it means it's totally pure. And sometimes people will just say, I don't know. So I want to spend a little time just thinking through, what does it actually mean when you see the label Certified Organic, or USDA, meaning U.S. Department of Agriculture, Certified Organic. The organics movement in the United States has evolved over time, but one of the first areas in which it became recognized under our federal law was through an act which continues to help set organic standards today, and that act is known as the OFPA, or the Organic Foods Production Act of 1990. Although the act itself is fairly dense and has a lot of content and has been amended over time, just reading it wouldn't give you a complete sense of what organic certification means in the United States, because subsequent to its passage, Congress empowered the U.S. Department of Agriculture to establish a whole additional set of regulations, often known as the National Organic Program, or the NOP, which breaks down and adds to a lot of the content that's already present in the Organic Foods Production Act. So in order to understand what rules, for instance, are organic growers or manufacturers expected to rely on, you would also need to read those regulations, or at least learn about them. If any of my audience is especially interested in going and reading through some of the content of the National Organic Program, you could find it through the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations, and it would be under Title 7, Subtitle B, Chapter 1, Subchapter M. And there you would find the Organic Foods Act provisions, and under Part 205, the National Organic Program. I'm going to assume, though, that most of my podcast listeners will probably never go read either the OFPA or the National Organic Program, for the understandable reason that it's written in fairly inaccessible and technical language. And so one of the things that I want to do next is just talk through 4 of the major requirements. They're not all of the requirements, but they're 4 that I think are particularly significant that organic growers and manufacturers have to adhere to in order to be certified organic. So the first of those requirements is contained in a list maintained by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's often known as the National List, and it has 2 categories. It has chemicals, which are exempt from the requirement that organic foods otherwise be free of chemicals. And then it has a list of natural substances which are prohibited even though they are natural and not chemical in origin. They still can't be used on organic food. So an example, for instance, of a natural substances which you still can't use on organic food is arsenic. Folks often don't realize that arsenic is not chemical. It's actually entirely natural in origin, and you can find trace amounts of it already in soil. But using arsenic as a poison, essentially to kill pests, for instance, is prohibited, even though arsenic is, strictly speaking, not a chemical. And again, as noted, a very limited number of chemicals are allowable under certified organic standards. So again, the list has 2 components. It has chemicals that are allowed, and it has natural substances that are prohibited. Anything that doesn't show up on the list and is a chemical can't be used, or chemical or synthetic, meaning human-made, can't be used in organic food production. And if a substance is natural in origin and it doesn't show up on the list, then it can be used. So that, again, is the first of the 4 requirements, that certified organic food or other products like certified organic supplements made from food have to have conformed to the national list. No prohibited chemicals, and also no prohibited substances that are natural, like arsenic. This category most fits, I think, what people often associate with organic food production, which is the idea of things being pesticide-free. And again, I want to highlight that there are exceptions to the rules about organic food not being subjected to any chemical or synthetic substances, though they are certainly subjected to a lot less generally than food that was not grown based on organic standards. So the second of the four categories I want to talk about is the use of what's called ionizing radiation or irradiation of food. And ionizing radiation essentially refers to using electromagnetic radiation, a form generally known as gamma rays. I know it sounds like something like science fiction, but it basically means actually using radiation to treat food at a cellular level. So food is irradiated for a number of reasons. One of the most common ones is that by irradiating food, you can slow sometimes the speed at which it ripens or spoils. So for produce, for instance, food irradiation is often used so that growers, manufacturers, and all of the intermediate parties who are getting products from farm to table won't lose as much of their product to spoilage before somebody can buy it. Food can be irradiated for other reasons. It's sometimes irradiated in order to eliminate certain kinds of pests, but irradiation in order to prevent spoilage is really common. So preventing food from spoiling doesn't sound like a terrible thing, but the challenge is that subjecting the food we eat to electromagnetic radiation has some quite significant potential harmful effects. Arguably the most significant is that when you're irradiating food and causing changes in the structure of that food at a cellular level, you're also increasing the presence of unstable molecules, which again, those of you who have listened to our pilot know can increase cellular damage or oxidative stress when we consume those foods. So irradiating foods essentially can make food more toxic. And food irradiation has been substantially linked by a number of studies to the increase of carcinogens, meaning cancer-causing substances in the food that we eat. So in a nutshell, when you buy a certified organic product, that means assuming that it was inspected and certified correctly, you can count on it not having been irradiated before it reaches you. The third requirement I want to talk about, folks tend to be a little more familiar with, and that is that if a product is certified organic, that means it generally cannot have been made with genetically modified ingredients or seeds. I want to qualify that there are some very limited exceptions to this rule, and so that's one of the reasons that I say generally, if something is certified organic, it won't have genetically modified ingredients. In other words, when you genetically modify food, you are changing its cellular structure, and it's very common when you do that you're creating more instability in that structure, which in a nutshell means more unstable molecules, which then can cause more cellular damage in your body. So similar to food irradiation, genetically modified foods in many instances are associated with the increased presence of carcinogens. And in addition, one of the negative consequences of both genetic modification and food irradiation in some instances is that as it changes the structure of the cells in a particular crop or food item, it also may be losing some of the nutrients that are usually present. So some of those qualities of food that are so healing, we lose when we irradiate or we genetically modify food. And further, we can make the food not only less healing, but essentially more toxic. There's one more requirement that I want to discuss that goes into organic certification, and it's the one that tends to most shock people and also the one I find that people are least familiar with. And that involves whether or not sewage sludge was used as a fertilizer in the production of food. And this can happen either because sewage sludge was applied directly to a crop, or it can happen indirectly because crops that were fertilized with sewage sludge were fed to animals that were then used to generate food. So I first want to just back up and define what I mean by sewage sludge. Sewage sludge is a term that refers to the solid material that floats to the top of sewer water. And it is comprised of a lot of human waste, but it also contains basically everything else that is in the sewer. And that literally can be hundreds, and in some instances, thousands of different contaminants or toxins. So examples can be heavy metals like the lead from people's pipes. It can be viruses. It can be the toxins or poisons in cleaning products. Essentially anything that we might flush down a drain, whether that's in a kitchen or a bathroom, right, will wind up in our sewers. And so there's really no way to separate all those toxins from that solid material. Sewage is generally processed in sewage treatment plants, but most of those contaminants will still remain afterwards. And it is thoroughly legal in the United States and has been for more than 2 decades to take that substances, meaning treated sewage, and to spread it over a field of crops and to use it essentially as fertilizer. And it works as fertilizer for the same reasons that, for instance, animal manure fertilizer does. There are nutrients in waste products that can essentially enrich the soil and help plants to grow. But when you're using sewage sludge as a fertilizer, as you might imagine, all of those toxins are also going directly into the soil and being absorbed by the food as it grows. And so one of the things that we see is then we can wind up with heavy metals, residue from various kinds of chemicals, poisons, drugs, and antibiotics, you name it, inside the cells of the food. Essentially, fertilizer is food for a crop. And so you want to think about it as if the crop that you're growing is eating that fertilizer. It's eating the sludge, and that means it becomes part of it. So sewage sludge, again, as noted, is legal to use as a fertilizer in the United States, and the only ways in which you could meaningfully ensure that you are not consuming sewage sludge in the food that you eat would be if you either grew the food yourself or formed a direct relationship with a grower and were familiar enough with what they were doing to be confident of what fertilizers or other substances they were using. Or you can buy food that's certified organic. It was a bit of a political battle, but certified organic standards do prohibit the use of sewage sludge in food in the United States. The last thing I want to say about this is part of the reason why sewage sludge is legal is that it's been endorsed by the Environmental Protection Agency, and they often use the term biosolids, which is essentially an industry term referencing sewage sludge and nothing else. They'll use both terms, but if you hear the term biosolids, that's what we're talking about. I want to briefly quote the Center for Food Safety, which describes sewage sludge as follows. They say, quote, "Sewage sludge includes anything that is flushed, poured, or dumped into our nation's wastewater system, a vast toxic stew of waste collected from countless sources, from homes to chemical industries to hospitals. The sludge being spread on our crop fields is a dangerous mix of heavy metals, industrial compounds, viruses, bacteria, drug residues, and radioactive material. Hundreds of people have fallen ill after being exposed to sewage sludge fertilizer, suffering from respiratory distress, headaches, nausea, rashes, reproductive complications, cysts, and tumors." And that ends the quotation. And again, the source on this is the Center for Food Safety. As their statement illustrates, the substantial dangers associated with growing food in sewage sludge are frequently challenged by environmental advocates, but as noted, the practice has been legitimized, regulated, and legalized under the auspices of the Environmental Protection Act and with the cooperation of the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. So at present, the practice continues to be legal, and the only reliable way as a consumer to avoid it is to buy certified organic food. Before I close this part of our discussion, want to mention a court case which was tried over 10 years ago in the federal courts in Georgia. The case in question is called McElmurray versus USDA, and it was decided in 2008 by Judge Anthony Alaimo of the 11th Circuit Court. And the case involved farmers who had sewage sludge repeatedly applied to the crop fields in which they were growing feed for their dairy cows. So they were running essentially a dairy farm and growing the food directly for the cows. And the sewage sludge was applied by the municipal government, I believe in Augusta, Georgia. And this went on for about 11 years, so they kept using sewage sludge fertilizer until they recognized a number of adverse effects, including hundreds of their dairy cows dying after eating the food. After Judge Alaimo reviewed all the evidence, one of the things that he said, and I quote, was this: "Senior EPA officials took extraordinary steps to quash scientific dissent and any questioning of EPA's biosolids program, period." So, in addition to the deaths of hundreds of dairy cattle, the case involved contaminated milk supplies which reached several states and contained thallium, which is the primary toxin that we find in rat poison and which they were able to verify had been present in the sludge spread on the crops which were fed to the cows on the McElmurray farm. So the court essentially found that their land was now too contaminated to be safe for growing any crops, and found in favor of the McElmurrays. Despite this kind of critique from other federal legal authorities, particularly our 11th Circuit Court, the basic standards for using sewage sludge as fertilizer remain the same and remain sanctioned by the Environmental Protection Agency. So again, in essence, if you would like to avoid having sewage sludge as a fertilizer in food that you're eating, the best way to do that, short of growing it yourself or again establishing a direct relationship with growers, is to rely on the certified organic standard, which prohibits the use of sewage sludge in growing crops. The last thing that I just want to acknowledge is a common question that I'm asked when I talk about this subject, which is why use sewage sludge as fertilizer? And it's notable that the laws which enabled this practice came about shortly after Congress prohibited dumping sewage sludge into the ocean. So one of the reasons is just that it became practical for municipalities that were trying to figure out where to put it. And the reason that sewage sludge fertilizer is often purchased by growers is that it's one of the cheapest fertilizers available because there is so much sewage. And so what we see is that millions of tons of sewage sludge are spread back onto cropland in the United States. And this has been a practice again for more than 2 decades in the United States. So I have more to say about the subject of certified organic, and I want to just delve a little bit into fact and fiction. What can we trust and what should we recognize as a myth or at least not a reliable truth? But I'm going to end this part and pick this up in part 2 of Certified Organic, Separating Fact from Fiction. Again, if you're on iTunes, please give us 5 stars and please feel free to connect with us on social media. You can find all of our links through our website, which once again is at repairconnect.org. Thanks so much for listening.